Welcome back, everyone. I can see people joining. Hope you've managed to have a good lunch break. If you just bear with us a few moments, we'll just allow for everybody to join. Just wait for the final bits of audio to connect. So welcome everyone. I'm just waiting for a few people to join. Final few joining. So welcome back everybody from lunch. So I think we'll get started while we wait for people to just join those final few. For those that I didn't see this morning, I'm Michelle Wright. I work for Cause4, one of the partners working on the Heritage Compass programme. So welcome so much to this session, which is on envisioning the future of heritage. We've got a fabulous panel and quite a large panel, which is wonderful. And I'm just going to briefly introduce each of them, and then we're going to go into some questions. And as each speaker is talking, if you have further questions for them, please just pop them in the chat, and we'll try and pick up as many as we can as we go. So we're looking at the future of heritage. We're going to start by looking backwards just for a moment, and then try and look wholly forward in terms of what the sector needs. So we have on our panel Geraldine, Kendall, Adams, news editor and writer at Museums Association, having written several news articles on arts, culture and heritage. And her topics cover changing leadership roles at major institutions, funding challenges faced by the sector and other notable events. Welcome to you. We have Winnie Imara, the founder of the Heritage and Honour Collection, an initiative created to document Black women in history from 1500 to 1999 in Britain. And Winnie's collected over 100 names of Black women in history to date. And through this, she provides creative workshops with Black history for all women, young women and girls for schools, colleges, universities and corporate companies. Welcome to you. We've got Nicola Nuttall, a consultant working in the cultural sector for 30 years, specialising in museum, gallery and art strategy, governance, advocacy, engagement and fundraising, a wide brief. Nicola is currently the part-time director of the Charles Causley Trust and a mentor, trainer and advisor to the Association of Independent Museums, Heritage Compass, Cause4 and the Universities of Exeter, Plymouth and Falmouth. Next is Jessica Monaghan, the Visitor Experience Director for the National Trust, having responsibility for setting the future direction for the experiences the National Trust offers at outdoors and pay for entry heritage sites across England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Again, a very big brief. Welcome to Jessica. And we have David Sheppeard, the co-founder and executive director of Marlborough Productions. David's work for the company has encompassed a wide range of projects, from the groundbreaking national touring theatre project New Queer Off the Block to the heritage project Queer in Brighton. Welcome to David. And finally, Edmund Lee, the sector resilience manager at Historic England, with a passion for helping people engage with their past. Edmund has a key focus on the trends and changes that are likely to challenge the organisations that make up the heritage sector in the next few years. So welcome and thank you all. I just very, very briefly am going to just set a tiny bit of context in two areas. One is the challenges and themes that we've seen through Heritage Compass, and then just a brief reminder of the National Lottery Heritage Fund's strategy themes as well. So what we've seen in thematic areas for Heritage Compass is lack of capacity to deliver effective programmes, obviously huge competition for funds and lack of available funding, some issues around skilled governance and trustees able to take organisations forward effectively, a reliance on volunteers and voluntary support, very vast increased costs to buildings, overheads and delivery with high inflation, lack of skills and training to support organisational growth, instability of key stakeholders and funding, including local authorities, as we heard this morning, recruitment and retention challenges of staff and volunteers, and burnout and poor well-being across the board for staff, trustees and volunteers. So this is some of the context that we're facing and that we're finding comes through again and again with heritage supported organisations. And then I'm not going to obviously repeat what Jacob talked about this morning in terms of the Heritage Fund's 10-year strategy, but this is obviously part of our funding context and part of what we'll be responding to and thinking about. So, open programs for all types of heritage projects, strategic interventions, partnerships that combine resources and expertise, and a focus on place, landscape, nature, heritage in need in responding to opportunities and emergencies. So I'm going to stop the share there and move to our first questions. So I'm going to ask a few questions to each of our panelists and then say we'll broaden it out, and I hope there'll be questions from participants as well in the audience. So starting with Winnie, please. I just thought we'd spend a moment looking back. So if we're looking back over the last 10 years, what can we learn? What's most relevant, would you say, to what's going to happen going forward?
Yeah, I think a lot has happened in the last 10 years. I think for me personally, when it involves heritage, there are things that I looked at. So when I started a Heritage Runner collection because of being a 17-year-old who was really passionate about period dramas, and I couldn't see myself in period dramas, and I was like, I need to Google and find out if someone like me existed in the 1400s, because I don't know why I'm not seeing myself. And when I was looking on Google, I found this article which was set in the 1700s, and it was these Black people, they were enjoying themselves with music and dance in a public house. That's what they used to call it back then. And this journalist walked past and he saw, them dancing, and he was like, this is bizarre. Why are they dancing and enjoying themselves? And that excited me and wanted me to want to know more. But then when I was Googling about history and heritage during that time, there was a little information rather than now. So again, let's say the last 10 years, information has come out a lot more. It has like drastically changed. And that's a good thing, because then I think moving forward in terms of the future, as you've asked, there's definitely going to be hopefully more information, but more clarity, because sometimes things seem unclear, but then also more it being kind of shared around spaces that can allow other people to know about different parts of history, rather than the history we've only been taught in schools, which hasn't been open and diverse. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Brilliant, thanks so much. And let's go to Geraldine. What would you say? What can we most readily learn from the past?
Thanks, Michelle. This was a really interesting kind of thought exercise, actually, because I kind of looked back over some of the stories we've covered in Museums Journal over the past 10 years, and it's really astonishing how much things have changed in such a short time. The conversation has changed. I think, as Winnie mentioned, we've really kind of learned to kind of acknowledge that there are voices missing from heritage. There are voices that have been excluded, and heritage institutions are not neutral, and they never have been. And I think we've kind of learned more about the kind of how to bring those voices in, tell those stories, and address some of the more contested and difficult aspects of the past. Unfortunately, that's also become a bit of a culture war issue, and I'm hoping it will kind of move to a more thoughtful place in the kind of future years. The other thing I'd mention is digital. I think that's moved from being a kind of peripheral thing to being central to the functioning of the heritage sector, and in almost every aspect. And yeah, it will be quite interesting to see where that goes going forward as well.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Let's go to Nicola.
Yes, following on to what Geraldine has just said, really, I think what's become really clear to me as I've got older and worked in the sector for longer is that change is constant, that we're never standing still. And I look back a long time now, but the late 90s into the early noughties, when I worked on the national campaign for learning through museums and galleries. And we ran that for 15 years. And at the time, looking back now, you'd say, how on earth did we need a campaign to promote museums and galleries as places to learn? That sounds bonkers. But in fact, there was a need at the time, and that transition has continued. And I think what we're seeing is my kind of feel for the sector is that we need to continually be reading the room. We need to be mindful of the environment in which we're sitting. We need to understand how we respond to changes that are happening in society, whether they're environmental, economic, or whether they're to do with societal change. So I think there's something about how I feel the sector has started. It's done it to an extent, but I think increasingly over the last few years, it's been forced into a space where it's had to look outside. And I think that's something that has changed quite considerably. And that's then affected things like recognising the importance of governance and good governance and how that affects how you run an organisation and so on. But I think there's something about that change continuum. We're always in a period of flux. We're always in a period of change. I think the economic crisis is, it's hideous for everyone, but especially the sector at the moment in this context that we're talking today. It's really difficult for us to maintain service as usual, but also to be looking to the future and looking for all those things that are expected of us as organisations. And it's how we start to distill some of the information that we've got, some of the partnerships, some of the connectivity, and I think understanding how we then advocate for change. And I think one of the things that worries me most is that when you have funding that's limited, you're naturally pitching one organisation against another. And I think that is really detrimental to the sector. And so it's how we come together collectively so that we're not fighting each other for the same resources. How do we collectively advocate for change so that proper funding comes into the sector?
Brilliant, thank you. Jessica, can we go to you next, please?
Yes, sure. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to spend some time with you virtually. So I think I'm going to reflect similar themes, actually. I just had 3 reflections I was going to share on looking back, what we can take into the future. I think fundamentally, I would observe that if we want to be relevant and to grow public support and to be genuinely useful, we've got to do outside-in thinking, not inside-out thinking. So I would agree with everything that Nicola's just said in terms of really understanding the societal and environmental changes around us, genuinely listening. Don't ever assume you're the audience. Who is the potential beneficiary, and how can we put ourselves in their shoes or bring those voices into the room? So I definitely think the power of outside-in thinking, rather than relying on inside-out thinking, is something we've learned as a sector, and I certainly see reflected in my own organisation. I think the second theme I was going to draw out is we're better together than we are alone. And I think we've learned so much about the power of coalitions and of partnership, but also of being a platform. We look after incredible, whether they be research assets for others to use and draw on, whether they be physical assets and spaces that other people can operate and use in really imaginative ways. I think the power of being a platform is something that we've started to learn about as well as a sector. So yes, so outside in thinking, we're better together than we are alone. And then the third area was economics matters, and a mixed economy is important, I think, is also something we've learned. So whether that's a mixture of public funding, social entrepreneurialism, being a fundraiser, being commercial, I think we've learned about the power of economics in a mixed economy to support and nurture and nourish our world that we operate in.
Thank you so much. David, let's come to you on this. What do we most readily learn from the past that's going to help now?
Yeah, I feel a lot of kind of resonance with what's been said so far. I guess what I wanted to contribute to this point was around co-creation and about the importance of kind of community collaboration. And when I think back to when I started working with museums, sort of 2012, it felt like a really intensely exclusive hierarchical space. And I do think that the way that kind of increased value placed on community collaboration and cultural democracy has changed things somewhat. We launched an exhibition with Wright Museum in 2020 that was community curated by our local queer community, and that was the first time that had happened in that space. And I think that when co-creation is done with integrity and when there is a real investment in sharing power and authority within heritage museum spaces, I think it can produce really extraordinary results and engage audiences in a completely different way. And I hope that despite the diminishing resources that a lot of people have alluded to, that's taken forward into the next 10 years, and that feels like a space of learning and a space of growth.
Fantastic, thank you. And finally, Edmund, what's your response to this?
That's really helpful to hear other people's points. I'm being the last to be asked. I had 5 points to start with, and 3 of them are completely covered already. So that's brilliant. I would just concur with the broadening of the definition of what we mean by heritage. That's been a really important learning in lots of different ways. I'd complement that with a growing understanding of needing to understand the narratives of loss. We can't keep everything, we can't look after it all. So how do we work with society to cope with loss, both of heritage assets and potentially of organisations as well, and projects. So something around that, certainly a learning there. To counter that, I think the third point would be the value of long-term planning and long-term funding approaches. And I think it's very helpful, enormously helpful, to see the lottery looking 10 years ahead. That's brilliant. And then I think I would, again, echo the value of collaborative and partnership working across the sector. Network would be my advice to anybody on this call. There's so much value in that. And then finally, I think to echo Jess, your point about outside-in thinking, we all need to be part of rather than separate to the audience. So just having that mindset, I think, is really important.
Fantastic, some amazing points there. Thank you. So if we look at now what's happening, we've got lots of challenge, obviously. We've heard lots of people speak about that. Hopefully we've got some opportunity. What support do we need right now, though, as heritage organisations of differing scales and types? What is most urgent right now, would you say? Let's start with David this time, if that's okay.
I suppose in terms of sort of urgency, it really feels like we're in a really, really difficult space, obviously, in terms of competition within funding. But I suppose particularly within, I guess I controversially can't say a change of government is what I think we probably need. That's what I believe. Within our community and the community that I work with, we're definitely experiencing the effects of what feels like a kind of government-stoked culture war. And I think what I really hope and I feel that we need now is to kind of move past this kind of divisive rhetoric and kind of find places that we can kind of collaborate within communities and across communities with greater ease and greater trust again. And I think that that's something that feels very present in the work that I'm doing within LGBTQIA+ communities. I suppose that's what I probably want to contribute to that point so far.
Yeah, thank you. Great start. Jessica, what's most urgent right now?
I guess it's hard to talk about what support without kind of acknowledging the kind of big drivers, isn't it? Whether that's the climate emergency or and we do have a cost challenge as well as a income and funding challenge. Those of us with viable commercial models in this room might still be running exactly the same thing now that we were in 2019, and you would still be contributing less to your ongoing endeavour or your ongoing cause or your ongoing charity, because we have a cost issue as well as a funding issue. And I think absolutely the kind of the cultural context of the complexity and charged emotions around needing to, I loved your phrase of broadening the definition of heritage, but reflecting and sharing and memory sharing and memory making across a really broad and diverse society, and the inequalities that exist around that, some of the challenges and contested conversation that exists around that. You know, they're clearly some of the big things I think we're facing into. We need to see them reflected really well in the NLHF strategy and strategic priorities. So I guess it was thinking about those things that I was thinking about support. I do think big organisations have a role to kind of play a role in kind of building coalitions and bringing people together. And whether that is in some of the lobbying or advocacy that Nicola mentioned, or whether it's coming together to find kind of new solutions or new approaches in that really difficult funding context, and thinking about where innovation could come from, new partnerships or new uses for spaces. I also think some of Edmund's points about making difficult choices, if a one-size-fits-all approach to conservation and preservation and care is something that we could come together around as a sector and think about supporting each other, on. And then I think continuing to grow our skill and confidence to work in coalition with audience. I think that's the kind of leveler, I think, the public that you're accountable to, and kind of understanding them, bringing their voice into the room, and kind of being able to be confident as a sector about how we do that and the skills and approaches required to do that. I think they would be some of the things I'd reflect on, Michelle.
Great, thanks so much. Can we go to you, Winnie? What's most urgent right now?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with just some of the points that David even mentioned in terms of funding. As soon as you asked that question, I thought funding straight away, because I think money and also it being accessible to all, you know, for example, I will always speak from my perspective. I'm from a lower class Black background, so and I'm doing what I'm doing in heritage is independent. You know, I'm not part of an organization or a massive institution where I can have all of this money, or whatever happens, there will be something given to you. Rather, I'm doing this out of my own back. So I'm coming from that perspective of like funding and money and it being accessible, it being and it being open to all in some sense where it's not so difficult, and it's accessible as well. And also in terms of accessibility, that is consistent, and we continually learn of what that actually means and how that actually looks for everybody. And yeah, I think I'll definitely leave it as that. Definitely funding and accessibility, it being open to all. And also I was going to say consistent change, because sometimes when people say that there is change happening, but I still feel like the change needs to be more established. I don't explain it, but just more established and firm in some sense, because it is happening, but then I still feel like things that I want to see is still not quite there yet, even though there's still change. So it's like having that discussion and figuring out how that change can be something that we all see consistently, and it's something that, for example, a young person can go to a particular environment and see the things that she can relate to based on her or his community.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. And Edmund, what do we need right now?
Thank you, Michelle. I'm coming from almost the opposite end of the spectrum, Winnie, in the sense of, I'm here representing a big government organisation with the value and the potential contribution to that. Certainly, yes, agree on the resource challenge. That's not going to go away. And I think there's a comment in the chat about that, which I completely agree with. The opportunity and the challenge for us, Historic England, is making making sure that government thinking takes account of heritage, and there is important work being done in establishing methodology within organisations such as the Treasury for actually valuing heritage in the same way as we're starting to value the environment in Treasury procedures. So it isn't just a matter of cost in bottom line finances, it's a matter of benefit, cultural heritage benefit as well. Another specific challenge for us is the workforce of the future. So who do we need to look after heritage we're looking ahead 10 years at the moment. Specifically for us, in the context of climate change, my team are looking at issues such as the skills needed to retrofit not just the obvious historic buildings, but the 21% of the housing stock which are more than 100 years old. So how can we bring those, what are heritage assets, if we look at them in that way, how can we bring those up to modern standards of efficiency? And where is the workforce that will deliver that? That's a real challenge that we have. I'll leave it there. There's lots of other things I could say.
Brilliant, thank you. And Geraldine?
Well, I mean, I concur with a lot of what's been said so far. The one I'd really like to mention is pay in the heritage sector, because so many of these things are driven by an amazing, passionate workforce, but that passion has been taken advantage of in terms of the pay. I worked on salary research about 1.5 years ago that showed that the pay is 10% lower than comparator sectors, and it's 16% below where it should be in terms of inflation. That was before the cost of living crisis and everything else. So it's it's something that I think is really urgent, and it keeps coming up. People are leaving the sector. We're losing knowledge and skills because it's just not sustainable financially for people to stay within the sector. So I think that is one of the things that just is very foundational to some of the other challenges that have been mentioned. The other one I wanted to mention, and I think Edmund also touched on this, was climate adaptation. And I think there really needs to be a very clear strategy for dealing with it. I mean, there's so many angles to the impacts that will be felt through climate. So there's the practical stuff, the building adaptation, retrofitting, changing planning laws, which I think is currently in the works and could be quite controversial in some ways. Managing how we communicate loss to the public and how that's managed. And also just dealing with how audiences will be responding. There, societal tensions. There'll be, kind of, I suppose, a loss of faith in our civic life, and there, I suppose that those are some of the big kind of philosophical things as well as the practical things. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts.
Thanks so much. And finally, Nicola, on this question, what do we need right now?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge question, isn't it, really? And the answers that we've seen from the panel already, though some concur with each other, we haven't covered everything by any means. And I think I've written down a few kind of headings, but I think there's kind of lots of subsets that go under this as well. So I've mentioned expectation, relevance, economics and capacity. They're the really big players. And under there, you can put like pay, for example. You can look at the expectations, and I think sometimes that's expectations that the sector puts on itself, what it thinks the public want, what it thinks they should be doing. And there's something about us taking time to stop and review what we do. Some of those really difficult financial questions about, well, we've always done it like this. We've got this trustee board that worked like this, or we've got, we've always engaged with this community, but they don't really respond very well, but almost negating responsibility for that. It's like, it's not our fault that they don't respond with us. It's obviously their fault because they don't get who we are. So I think there's a whole revisioning of who we are, what we are, why we do what we do. And And I think there's something there around, you know, actually putting our hands up and saying, look, funding is limited. At the moment, resources are so poor that it's not enough to say we're a great organisation with good governance that have put in a good funding application, because it is a lottery when you put in funding applications. And I think there's something about that philanthropic space. There's something about how we articulate the need and capabilities and potential of our sector more effectively. And in doing so, engage other communities with us who perhaps just don't feel any love for us at all, don't see the relevance, but also to change the mindset of the policymakers and the funders to say, look, let's not stop, you know, faffing around in the edges and saying, oh, but look, we've sorted out a different way of doing this. We need more money, we need more investment. I don't want to keep harking on about the campaign for loans to museums and galleries, but it was a really incredible journey in terms of going from convincing the funders and the policymakers that the sector was something to value and work with, through to then working with the individuals within the museums and the galleries to be able to say, right, what support do you need to help you deliver that? What is it that's going to help that happen? And then advocate that what was possible out to the communities and out to audiences. So there's always those three parts to this. It's not just about more money, it's about capacity and capability in the sector, and it's how we engage with audiences. And so it's how we draw those things together. But money doesn't solve everything, but it makes life an awful lot easier. So if we had less time to be concentrating on, can we afford to pay the electric bills? You know, can we pay those members of staff? How's it looking? It gives us the freedom, and this is something that's been mentioned today quite a few times, about how Heritage Compass has allowed, this programme has allowed people to stop and think. They've had a bit of capacity to actually stretch their minds and not just be thinking about their to-do list. And I think we are a creative sector. You know, we should be in that space to create change and new ways of working. But what's happened over the last 10 years in particular has been this, as has happened right across society. And again, like David, I don't want to be too political, but I will if you get me started. You know, that we've been undermined. We've had the kind of the lifeblood taken out of our sector. And it's how we work collectively, collaboratively to change that picture. So sorry, that's a bit of a long answer, but there's something about our expectations on ourselves. There's something about recognizing that change needs to happen. There's something about recognizing the relevance of what we do, and then how we make sure that that's properly funded, allowing us to really grow as a sector. The campaign was the one that coined the phrase museums change lives. And I remember having arguments with a number of people who said, no, they don't. What are you talking about? No, they don't. And they absolutely do, as does the wider heritage sector. And it's about how we articulate that, how we make sure that the people that need to know that as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And then coming on to think ahead, what are our kind of big tickets? What are our sort of key themes for the next 10 years? What are we going to have to respond to and get right? Edmund, let's start with you on this, if that's okay.
I think looking forward sort of like reflects what we discussed already. I mean, looking forward under the anticipation of change. I think we need to understand how society relates to the heritage sector. We need to understand the heritage sector better. And there's work that Historic England are doing to try and broaden our understanding of who are the organisations in the heritage sector. And Heritage Compass has been fantastic in bringing together a large number of organisations in the sector, but who else is there who could have benefited from Heritage Compass or could benefit from something similar in the future? So looking ahead to that work coming available in the next year or so. We touched on that thinking about other aspects of the future of the workforce. How are we going to deal with the Great Retirement, as was the phrase that was coined last year? As we have an ageing population, that's potentially a threat to those who are active participants in the sector retiring, but there's also the opportunity of experienced heritage professionals having more leisure time. What is the potential there for the future volunteer workforce. I think connected to that, I would anticipate a lot more community-led initiatives in the heritage sector. I think there's been some excellent examples. I would just cite from the archaeological world, the Operation Nightingale project, if I might, which is a community-led initiative which has identified the well-being benefits of actually taking part in an archaeological excavation, and is making those benefits available to injured service personnel. So you have some fantastic work being done by Operation Nightingale. So yeah, more community-led, broadening the definition of what is heritage, and anticipating and meeting the needs of a changing workforce. I think those are the 3 pointers I'd start with.
Great, thanks so much. And let's go to Geraldine next. What's your response to that future?
I think mine are actually very similar. They so I mean, I think it's already been touched on a lot, but sustainability is and that encompasses everything from financial to environmental to everything else. And there is that tension between needing to keep the doors open and then wanting to fulfill your wider mission and be socially impactful and do all the kind of, you know, wonderful things that we know that museums can change lives. I'm glad that someone mentioned that campaign, and it's I think one of the themes, I think, which is reflected in the new strategy from the Heritage Fund, is making do with what we've got, making the most of what we've already got. So there's that kind of real clear move away from some of the big new build capital projects that one might say we're in the millennium era, and just kind of recognizing that unlimited growth isn't sustainable in terms of buildings, collections, footfall, everything else. It's just a much more holistic approach to building relationships with communities, and a kind of sorry, I've lost my my train of thought. And the other thing that has also been touched on is that broadened definition of heritage, and I'm sure some of you will be aware of the decision by the UK government to ratify the Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage, and I think that should be a really interesting kind of opportunity to kind of think about what heritage is and what purpose it serves to different people, and you know, the kind of new partnerships and new things that could come out of that are quite interesting. I'll leave it there.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And let's go to Winnie on this question.
Yes, thank you so much, Geraldine and Edmund. You've raised some really good points, and yeah, similar to them as well. Definitely more collaborations, new spaces, spaces that different communities feel like they are able to express themselves to their full capacity, and able to embrace their heritage and their culture, and you know, what museum and history and life means to them in whatever aspect. Community-led initiatives as well. Yes, please. We definitely need more of that. And community is such an important thing as well. I thought when I think about London, or well, I don't know where everyone is at the moment, but I'm from London. It's very community-led. And when we do come together and we create things that represent the community that is in London, and I'm a Black woman, but it doesn't have to be about my community, different types of communities as well, but just a reflection of where we are, and how our culture looks like right now. And also education-based led initiatives as well. Education, I feel like, is such a big thing. And I know that museums work a lot with you know, schools and colleges and universities, etc. So I'd love to see how that collaboration works in terms of things that can be created, education-based, like, I don't know, programs and initiatives that people can take part in, that they can be a part of, or people can create themselves, or just things that people know that they can be a part of and create and share with the world. So yeah, I definitely would say those 4 points, obviously grabbing from Edmund and Geraldine already.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. And let's go to Nicola, please.
Again, I don't want to repeat what's already been said, but I think there's something especially around education and learning, and that's kind of where my life started, in community archaeology and so on. So it's about how you engage people in different environments. If you look back at where not the broad heritage sector, but especially museums and galleries started, they were educational institutions. They were places where you could potentially access a library, but you certainly couldn't pop on a computer and have a quick Google to find out all you needed to know. So it's where you came to see what an elephant looked like, or what a 14th century manuscript might look like, and lots of things in between. So it's how we keep that kind of transition, how we keep that awe. So there's something about seeing something on a screen in a digital format. There's something very handy about it. We're all here today digitally, which has saved us all getting trains or whatever to, distant off places, leaving at 5 in the morning. So there's lots of benefits, but there's something about the tangible seeing, being in a space together, seeing a real elephant, seeing a 14th century manuscript, and so on. So it's not forgetting that we've got the magic behind us as organisations to really kind of inspire people. I think that's really important. And I think there's also very much around the issue around the cost of living crisis, and the funding crisis will continue to rumble. I think somebody had put in the chat that even if we do get a new government, there's no money left in the pot. It's not like the heady days when Tony Blair popped in and he had full coffers. There's no money left at the moment. So I'd really like to see a Scandinavian model where people are paying proper taxes and then having proper services to enable us to do what we need to do: care for people, educate people, support society. But I'm afraid I'm just a liberal. But there's something here about how we value what the sector is. And just to say, I think, and I've said this to Michelle before, and it's not to make her blush, but I think Heritage Compass programme has been phenomenal. It's brilliant. I've worked in training in the sector for 30 years, and I think this is one of the best programmes I've seen in all that time. And I think there should be more of this. This is what's needed. What I've found is, I've been part of the programme as a course leader, but also as a critical friend. There's not been enough time. We're scratching the surface now. We're getting people into a space. We need continuity. So I'd say perhaps goes back to what Geraldine was flagging about the sector, training, how we keep that change going, I think is really important. So what else can be done? Who else can fund this kind of really, really valuable work?
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Let's go to David.
I totally agree with Nicola in terms of the kind of magic of the physical and the material culture of heritage. I think what I'm interested though as well is projects that can kind of seamlessly move between digital innovation and the sort of material culture. And I've seen, I guess, within queer heritage, some really interesting examples of that kind of slippage, and how digital can kind of amplify and modify and sort of improve that experience of physical things. And a couple of examples that I'm really excited about is Museum of Transology, which is a physical collection kept at Bishopsgate, but has a huge kind of crowd generated collection of trans objects in the UK. I'll put a link to their National Day of Collecting that's happening in the chat. It's really something worth getting involved in with your local trans community. And also a project that I just really loved earlier this year, which was in Liverpool, an artist called Luke Fawcett, who was working with older people creating 3D renderings of lost queer spaces, and just how digital can offer this whole new dimension to memory, to oral history, to kind of a different sense of materiality around heritage. And I just think that's a really exciting space. And I think it doesn't belie the importance of physical collections. I actually think it can just bring them to life and demonstrate their value in a lot of different ways. I think it's a really exciting space.
Yeah, brilliant. And finally, Jessica, and then if people have questions, participants, please pop them in the chat and we'll come to questions. But Jessica, over to you.
Yes, sure. I think, well, I concur with my learned colleagues, I think, probably on a lot of what's been said. So I had a few things in mind for this one. So yes, benefiting a broad, diverse and changing society will, I think, remain a key theme for us. You know, heritage is a cultural and human expression. It's got to remain useful and relevant. So, and that's already been touched on. I think the challenge in funding, particularly at a local level, and you know, and that's really challenging for small and medium organisations, I think. And that could mean that is where we see some innovation in the next 10 years, actually, in terms of how we think about those spaces, what they're for, how they're used, who we work with, and definitely speaks to the theme of partnership and collaboration that comes through strongly, but it might also speak to Nicola's point and the kind of scale of systemic intervention that might be needed. It just made me think back to the change to the taxation system that was made in the post-war period to enable lots of country houses to be saved, for example, for the nation. And you know, I don't know what that might look like, but there is something about the role of big organisations and funders in thinking about, you know, scale of intervention potentially needed. I think, but yes, just a little trip down memory lane there about a big intervention once in the past. I think the other points, that others have already made, climate and climate change and adaptation seems an obvious theme that I think, and also nature. You know, let's not forget, sorry, our heritage includes our natural heritage, and actually I think there's a real role there potentially that, you know, that is an opportunity for certain types of heritage assets. So if we think about our historic gardens and parklands, they actually have a role to play in climate resilience, but they also have a role to play in engaging people with the impact climate will have on changing some of the assets in our care. We're already seeing gardens have to change their planting schemes, conversations with the public about that, what climate resilience in gardens and parklands looks like. So I think we have a positive role to play there potentially, as a sector as well. I also think there's something about the power of heritage spaces as social conveners. Interestingly, it's the number one reason people come to places in the care of my organisation. We've asked them, the number one reason they come to us is to spend time with other people. So there's something about the power of social convening and connective spaces, which I just think is going to continue to be incredibly important. Conversation and connection, particularly because, you know, some people do not have the privilege of access to big spaces to convene and connect. So we've got a really important contribution there to make, I think. So yes, I think, and then just the final thing was just, I would note a bit of a theme of place-based approaches. You can see that in the NLHF, but I also notice it in other funders are thinking about that in terms of some other, and there is something for me about whether there's an opportunity for some organisations who are all looking at kind of place-based approaches to perhaps think about coming together around some of those places to create really naturally and culturally rich ecologies for the communities they serve. So whether there's an opportunity there, it was just a thought.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So we've got a couple of things in the chat. Karen's put a good provocation about enabling succession by the up and coming workforce innovators. So looking at the other end of the scale from what perhaps Edmund was talking about. Are there a couple of panelists that might like to take that one? Just put your hands up and we'll just go to a couple of people. Yeah, brilliant. Nicola, you go first.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of work working with universities around internships, for example, and starting the process. And through my work at the Charles Causley Trust, we recruited a whole team of new sort of early career sector professionals. So they're the ones that were literally straight out of university. Some of them had been interns with us, some of them hadn't been, and just growing and developing them. And a couple of them actually engaged with the Heritage Compass programme, for example. So how you're starting that, universities are keen to find ways to connect with our sector. They have, this makes me cross this bit, and I work in a university and I also have done in the past. that they don't necessarily put money the way of the cultural sector to support that engagement, which is something that needs to change. But they are really keen for young people in their care to come and work with you and develop their own skills and CV and so on. There's something about developing learning organisations as well, which I think is really important. So again, the way we've modelled the Charles Causley Trust is around having a learning organisation, which it's not just about what we're doing to and with external people who are engaging with what we do, but it's the whole ethos of our board, of the people who work and engage with us as well. So we look at things like having a shadow board, having people who are coming through who want to learn and develop different skills. We have a big volunteering program as well, where young people can find and develop their skills as they're moving through. And it doesn't just have to be, you know, young people. And also we've been spending a lot of time looking at people that perhaps have been out of work for some time, people who've lost their confidence, people who have long-term health conditions, and we nurture them in a space where they may start by volunteering, or we may start paying them on a freelance basis, but to look at how different people bring different things to your organisations and how you support that development and learning, because experience and expertise comes in many different forms and your organisation needs lots of different ones. So I'd really encourage people to develop a learning basis ethos to their organisation at every single level. Look at buddying up systems, look at ways so that there's always the question about succession planning for boards, what happens when people have left or want to leave, how on earth do we fill those spaces? There are lots of people coming into the sector who would love the chance to develop those skills, but they wouldn't necessarily come in and be the chair or the treasurer without having had some nurturing beforehand.
Great, thanks. Anybody else want to take that one? That question about upcoming workforce? No, okay. We'll move on then to Andy said, where have all the philanthropists gone? But I think that's a wider question about, you know, it's tough out there on funding. Where do we best spend our time right now? Again, a couple of you want to take that. Edmund, thank you.
I just put in a word again for networking, making use of all the network opportunities you have, such as Heritage Compass, but I would put in a word for online communities. We've talked about digital today extensively, but one role of digital technologies is the ability to have platforms, forums, discussion boards, places where you can go and find others who are facing similar challenges. And learn from them, partner with them. So please make use of those opportunities. I will put a note in the chat of an initiative that we're doing to try and support that at the moment.
Brilliant, thank you. Nicola?
And I'd just say, it's easy to say where the philanthropic givers, where have they gone? I think it's more about making sure that your story, what it is you're trying to get across, what you're campaigning for, is crystal clear. So it's your case for support is the most important thing, I think, at this stage. It's understanding that you know what you're asking for, you know what you need. And that's often when you start to then distill down who it is you need to speak to, who you need to approach. So rather than having that blanket approach to, we'll just put lots of applications in or we'll speak to lots of people, often if you were to go to an individual and say, we are fundraising for this thing, we need £5,000 to do it, we're looking for 5 donors at £1,000 each, you're really clear, there it is, you can ask that ask and someone can respond to it, rather than a generic ask, which might be, we need some support to make sure that the organisation keeps running. So it's getting your stall really carefully and clearly laid out, then often helps you to develop those kind of connections and pinpoint who it is who can help.
And then there's something from Catherine on collective action around fundraising and tax deductions. But as our last thing, I was sort of struck by the talk at the start of the importance of partnership collaboration. But actually, you know, whilst it's so important and we all know that, actually in practice, it's quite hard to achieve. So again, I was just wondering, as our final thought, of if any of the panelists have thoughts on how we create the conditions for that. How we better support, you know, collective action or better partnerships, or better joined up. Thanks. David?
I suppose transparency is really, really key. And I think especially sometimes when you're dealing with larger organisations, there's a degree of at least in my experience, there's a degree of somehow kind of like shaping perceptions or shaping organizational ego. Sometimes people don't want to admit their vulnerability. I think they're having to do that more and more in this funding climate, and I just think that all partnerships just come from, when they come from that place of openness and that place of transparency, just have a habit of turning out much better, about being clear on your intentions. And I think that as a smaller organization collaborating with larger organizations, a lot of the time, just being really clear that we know our own value, we know the value of the communities that we're bringing into those spaces that otherwise wouldn't be there. And I guess what I'm overall saying is just being aware of power dynamics and partnerships and how those might warp or change the way that you behave. And I think that's I think that when they're acknowledged, it tends to work better.
Yeah, I think brilliant point. Nicola, probably our final point.
Sorry, unless anyone else wants to chip in at this point. I was just going to say the importance of capacity, that I've been doing a lot of work in Cornwall recently where we've been applying for levelling up funding, and it really was a scrabble to the fence. You know, I'd have lots of conversations about partnership and really genuinely wanting to work collectively, but when someone's dangling a carrot in front of you, it's the first person over the fence that gets that carrot, and that's a real issue, a real issue. That I've spent most of my career telling people to work in partnership, and I'm still a very strong believer in doing so. But there's something about the systematic environment in which we're sitting, which is creating competition, which is making that difficult. So whether that's, you know, decisions from the Arts Council about which areas are priority places, and they're often just divided by a river, you know, or a pencil on a map around a boundary. It's about how do we take away some of that systematic noise, if you like, that's stopping partnerships working as well as it can, but absolutely working in partnership. As David said, making sure that you're aware of power dynamics. And I'd also recommend that people think about how they could possibly work with local universities or universities local to them. They tend to have lots of funding, but it is very tightly managed. So it's not like they can just hand it out. It's not the golden goose, you know, or the golden egg. It's very much how you fit within that space as well. But it's having the capacity to have those thoughts in the first place, to develop those conversations. And that's a big shift.
Great. Well, we're right up to time. So huge thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Winnie, Geraldine, Nicola, Jessica, David and Edmund. Much appreciate your time, and lots of food for thought there. I think Annie's just going to talk about our next session.
Yeah.
Hand over to her.
Brilliant. Thank you so much to all of us.